everybody. I'm a senior fellow at McGraw-Hill, helps the CEO figuring out where McGraw-Hill is going in terms of digital learning in the future. But I also help everybody in the organization implementing the technologies we have in adaptive learning, helping them understand or helping them adjust the way McGraw-Hill is doing business around learning, from transforming from a publisher to last year, for the first time, having more cash revenue coming from digital products than from printed books. That's a very, very big pivot for a company like McGraw-Hill. It started here. This is the tallest building in my country. On the top of this, there is the largest simulation center in Northern Europe in medicine, where we started looking at how do doctors and nurses make errors when we put them under pressure. In Denmark alone, 8,000 people die preventably every year. In the US, it's close to 100 probably because of medical error. It's a massive problem. It was thought back in the early 90s when we started looking at this that it was all a matter of human factors like crew, team collaboration. It was a matter of standards and algorithms and checklists. But something else emerged when we were building these simulated environments where we could study what happened when you put operating crews under pressure. It was pretty clear that all these things mattered as well. But there was one thing that really set medicine apart from aviation, where we inherited a lot of the human factors theory from, which was that the knowledge base is much, much bigger. It's incredibly much bigger, actually. Much bigger than we thought it was. Anyway, so if you look at aviation, they apply 50 to 100 skills. They're just really, really good at it. And they maybe have less than 25 concepts that are really important to understand to be able to operate safely as a pilot. But you have to be really good at it. Take a golf player. It's not a large number of things to learn in your brain. There's not a lot of cognitive learning objectives, but that doesn't mean that you can become the number one in the world by just learning those few learning objectives. What's different in medicine, and what turned out to be most other academic disciplines, is that there is a different aspect of it. The sheer number of learning objectives, I often refer to it as the mountain of stuff we try to store in their brains, is so big that everybody runs out of time. What does that mean? That means that you start to sporadically, more or less sporadically, eliminate things. The better learner you are, the less sporadically you do it. The more systematic you are about prioritizing what you store and how. So part of what we saw back in these days when we were building these very advanced simulated environments was that a tip of the iceberg problem, we saw something that happened 10, 15 years after graduating med school. But it was actually often rooted all the way back into high school or college education, where something happened there. Typically what happened was they crammed. That you were reading one chapter in week one, another chapter in week two, and so forth and so on. And you always progressed through them. You never went back to chapter one. The good students do. That's pretty characteristic that the good students, they do go back and close the gaps. The weaker students don't. Then 2 weeks before the finals, then they start cramming. And that's when you run into the trying to climb the mountain of stuff, and it doesn't work. And particularly it doesn't last. So you may be able to get through your finals, but the knowledge you have tried to acquire does not stick. And that's what we constantly saw in these environments, and it becomes more accentuated when you put people under pressure. So what we learned back then by trying to solve a problem in medicine, or understand a problem in medicine, was that this is a much more widespread problem. And there is severe interaction between all the different things that happens to you while you go through school, because the mountain of stuff is not one mountain per subject. It's the total amount of stuff you're trying to put in your brain. You only have one brain. You only have one set of eyes. All needs to get through the same eyes into the same brain. So all the things we pile on top of these students really matter. About 2002, we started to get interested in what if we started to address the mountain of stuff as a way to free up capacity to also be able to deal with the very complex things. When I started working with McGraw-Hill in 2007, every single author team I met with, and we've made 1,400 products now. I haven't been involved in every single one of them, but all the first ones I was. So every single author team said, no, we're biologists. It's really high-level learning objectives. We're teaching up here. Like this, we want problem solving. We want like analytical skill, high-level Bloom stuff, you know. I said, that sounds great. before we jump to that, let's try to map out everything you put in your textbooks and figure out what is, in other words, I didn't call the mountain of stuff to them. Let's just see how big your mountain of stuff is. And then they did it, and they came back, and we had these very, very detailed maps that is part of the foundation for adaptive products. And then I said, that's very interesting that you say that everything you're interested in is up here, because 97% of your learning objectives are Bloom's level 1 level learning objectives. And then they're like, yeah, but what's really important is this, but you cannot get to this here if the students need to pass the mountain of stuff first. So you could, and then they say, oh, you're just trying to dumb biology down. I said, no, I'm trying to actually get you to what you're convinced about biology is. But you have to realize that there is limited capacity in the brain. So part of it is, maybe it's not realistic to say we cut down the curricula to half. In many cases, what's in the textbooks is actually not meant for the students to learn. It's just there so that the students, or the perception from the author teams is that the students will get the context so they understand the really important things better. One of the challenges for students is that they don't know what they really should try to learn and what is just there for context. So part of what you can do with adaptive systems is you can help them overcome that hurdle. But there is also another problem, which is when you present them or put them right in front of the mountain of stuff. What happens is that you look at that mountain and you're like, I'm not really good at math. It's an enormous mountain that is ahead of me. Let me go over here and do something easier. Anybody seen that with your students? So the more approachable we can make the mountain of stuff, the easier it is in itself to get the students to try to climb it. The second part is, if we can find a way to motivate them on the way, that helps as well. Because this is a really critical part of it. This guy works for me. So he won the Olympic gold medal in London. He is less than a year away from graduating as a physician from University of Copenhagen. He's got 2 kids while he's been an Olympian. And he's competing in Rio. He held the world record for about 8 years. And his wife is also competing in Rio and in London. But he's not the norm. So what sets this guy apart from everyone else, or almost everyone else? A number of things set him apart. The first one is this, because this is his daily life, both literally and in a translated sense. That's also what he feels like when he needs to go pick up the kids and all the other things, make sure that he gets prepared for tomorrow. This is his daily life every day. Most students are not willing or able to do that. Another thing that sets him apart is that he's extremely structured about his time. He's very, very precise about not wasting a second in any of the different spheres of his life. And the third thing that sets him apart is that he's incredibly dedicated. He has a goal, he knows where he's going with his private life, with his studies at the University of Copenhagen, and he knows he wants to win in Rio. Students are not like that. Students are like this guy. They're lost. They're lonely wolves. But what we can learn from the top performers is a lot of things. But we have to realize that most of the students, 95% of them, I will argue, have some aspects of being lonely wolves. They don't know where they're going. They don't know how to prioritize their time. They don't know what's more important and what's less important. I think over time, many of them can develop and grow into something else, but they're not there from the get-go. This is a shocking finding from late last year from a new math curriculum we've developed. It's not a lot of students, it's just below 1,000, I think. After they've graduated from 12th grade, they did not qualify for college. So they had to they were placed into developmental math. After 12 years of math education, 76% of them failed solving a simple problem. That's pretty scary, right? But this is not the shocking part, because we know that 3/4 of the world population is, the rumor is, or the expectation is that 3/4 of the world population hates math. 3/4 of the world population, exactly the same as 3/4, think they suck at math. And even more important, 3/4, the same 3/4, think they cannot improve in math. But we know different now. So we gave them a very simple exposure, a very short, simple exposure to a new way of using adaptive technologies to teach math. This is a few minutes intervention, maybe up to an hour. We can get half of the ones who are otherwise failing after point percentage of all the math education that had in the past, we're able to remediate half of them. That's a big impact. I'm expecting you to read every single box. This is where you have the problem, and here you have the solution to it. All of these pathways represent correct ways that actually eventually got the student to the correct solution. So this is not students failing. This is students succeeding. This is only, I think, 800 or 900 students. What is interesting about it is we were expecting that there would be quite a wide variation on how students solve the same problem. This is a fairly simple problem. But look at this. Look at how many fringe cases there are. These are the fringe cases where if you have a computer system that is not adaptive enough, these students will be scolded. They will be told you're doing it wrong. But actually these students were doing it right. They were just thinking about math in their own way. Think about softer areas where it's even less exact, where we can easily tell students that they're all wrong about this when they're trying to store it in their brains. All of these students got it. So the value of an adaptive system is the ability to accommodate the fringe cases. It's not being able to predict the most common pathways, because we know them. Those are the ones that most of us stereotypically have been using. So there are three major factors of looking at values of an adaptive system, or what actually characterizes a good adaptive system. We make some of them, and over the next years you will see many. My guess is this is the biggest change in educational technology, that we begin to see that the computers can mold what happens to the students around that individual student. And you'll see it in many different variations over the next years, but promise me to think about it in this way. It's not the computer that does anything good to the student. It's the educational technology that the computer delivers. But it's not only the fact that it is educational technology, it's how that educational technology works. And we're moving from a very unqualified early market where people could get excited just because we got a tablet in the hands of the students. That's not where we will be in 5 or 10 years. It will be as normal as carrying a cell phone. Nobody's excited about being able to have a cordless phone that you can carry with you. It's all about coverage, performance, all the other things around it. So for adaptive systems, there are three factors that are really important to remember. The first one is, of course, how does the fundamental engine work? What is the methodology it uses in order to mold things around a student? And there are two major camps out there. And the big difference is one is using an engineering approach to it. We're using a biological approach to it. We invented a biological approach to adaptive learning about 10 years ago. We don't have many followers yet, and there's a reason for it, and I'll come back to it. But I also explain what is the contrast between an engineering approach and a biological approach to this. So fundamentally, what an adaptive system like this should do is it needs to sequence what happens next. The core of an adaptive engine is a sequencer that decides, do I ask another question, or do I present the student with something new to learn? Do I go back and ask the student to practice something they've learned in the past? There are all these competing things that you could decide to do. What is simple is that time is ticking in a one-dimensional direction. You have one student with one set of eyes and one brain, and you have to figure out what happens there. So you have to get it down to, what do I do next? We sometimes refer to it as the competition for the highest impact minute. So the next minute we're spending should always be the best spent minute. And then you just start from the most important things first. In order to make this work, you have to balance multiple different needs. And you can either decide, which is a pretty natural thing the first time you try to build one of these systems, to say, let's think about math. If you fail dividing fractions, let's go back to dividing whole numbers. So you build like a set of arrows, and you say, let's just go back to the safe point behind this, or the earlier safest point where we know that they've understood this. But what if you learn math in a different way? It's actually the biggest disaster in building an adaptive system to try to do that. For those, I've done it for 2 decades, building systems of this kind. And when you see the biggest blow-ups of adaptive systems where they generate what we call boomerangers, people who perform worse after the educational intervention than before, it's actually when you build systems like this. Why? Think about a dyslexic student. A dyslexic student where it's often the conformity of the language and the way we communicate things that gets in the way. It's not because they're stupid. It's because they just need to process it in another way. So I have a colleague at McGraw-Hill who's both himself severely dyslexic and his son is. They're both, as my new friends in Boston where I moved last year say, they're both wicked smart. But they cannot learn it this way. But his son can divide fractions, but he just cannot do the formalism of writing it with horizontal lines. So it's really interesting that if you think about it this way, then a system that is too rigid will not work. Does that ring a bell compared to too rigid teachers? Teachers who are punitive, who are scolding students? Does that work? No. So it's exactly the same problem you have on computers as you have in real life. You have to be accommodating. What do good teachers do if you have enough time? You ask a lot of questions, right? So when you see the quality of an adaptive system, so come back to the very simple thing, seek to understand before you try to be understood. That's the same thing as in computers as it is in real life. But it's hard to get computers to do because computers don't really understand, but they need to get close to something that looks like understanding and feels that way for the student and is able to qualify what you do next. In order to make those decisions, we take a lot of things into account. This is an example of some very well-known memory research that is fairly trivial to implement, but as an example of something we feed into the models is simple models of knowledge decay. This is Ebbinghaus's findings from 1886, so 130 years old stuff almost. That you forget stuff. If you repeat it, it stays for a little bit longer. If you repeat it again, even longer, and so forth and so on. Later referred to as spaced repetition. It's relatively easy to put this into an adaptive engine. But just think about it. What if you then take the following 130 years of cognitive research and also put in there, and then we balance all these different things up against each other? We have a really interesting possibility or opportunity with the adaptive systems because the students are using them throughout an entire semester. What does that give to us? It gives us an ability to look at their workload over a very long period of time, even including things like, do they separate repetitions by sleep? It's a separate research finding. It's just interesting how easy it is to do if you're able to look at students spanning their effort spanning an entire semester. So you can actually take information out of looking at when did they actually do the repetitions. Did they cram it in one day, or were they able to spread them out over the week? What that does is it informs how likely they are to forget it later. So suddenly these models that take many, many different things into account, how confident they are about their answers, I'll come back to that. All these different things are taken into account when we make the decision on what to do next. You can think about the difference between Yahoo and Google in the early days. Yahoo was trying to put everything into boxes, have people characterizing and tagging where a website belongs, where Google said, it's going to be too unwieldy, it's too complex. We need to look at a ton of different things, and we need to be ready for the future by taking in things on the fly to try to make these decisions. Do you use Yahoo anymore? No. I don't either. And the reason why is that these more organic approaches to using computers, which is, one is hardcore engineering, another one is closer to an organic model that constantly evolves, has a much, given that it's humans we're dealing with, it has a substantially stronger impact on learning if you do it that way. Our ability to predict what to do next is much, much higher than if you say, oh, you missed dividing fractions, go back to dividing whole numbers. Last time I tried to derail one of our competitors' products, it took less than 2 minutes before it came up with a funny thing that you do. And the reason why is that it's very, very easy to make an innocent mistake. And we saw that in the early days of LearnSmart with the same author teams. Because we thought that, and I used to be a teacher in neuroanatomy and gross anatomy at University of Copenhagen. And I thought I was great at knowing what the students were struggling with. So of course, I thought I would be able to write great remediation on distractors. Because everybody knows that when the students, when you ask them what happens at a hip fracture, how do they present with the legs? And they come back and say, yeah, they know it's out-rotated, or laterally rotated. And then you say, why? And then they come up with the same 3 answers. The difference is, I was thinking of the ones where I could figure out what they were getting wrong. But then if you look across an entire population, entire semester, an entire topic, we started to doing stats on it. So when author teams were writing remediation comments for this ahead of time, when we then looked at which remediation comments I actually used, 10% of the remediation comments that were written were used. Then we looked at when were remediation comments actually needed. Only 10% of the needed remediation comments were there. If you multiply those two, you get to about a 1% hit rate. That's not good. So we did something else. We started driving all of the content authoring based on where the needs are, where the students' real misconceptions were. And what happened was we realized that we cannot predict where the students are going. We cannot predict where the students will be struggling, but we can measure it, and then we can respond to it. Another thing that is really important to feed into these models are softer things like how do the students actually feel about their knowing something? And then you'd say, oh, this is some whiffy-waffy stuff. It's actually pretty concrete. Anders Ericsson has studied experts like Mats and Tiger Woods and expert piano players. You may have heard that it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert. How many of you have heard that? It's Anders' work. It's been quoted by many others, but it's his work. And he's a good friend, and I've spent a lot of late evenings with him over a glass of wine, trying to figure out how we could translate his research on experts into something we could use to help normal students learn. Now, one of the first things we did many years ago was we introduced this, where we basically, every time we asked them a question, we asked them how confident they are about the answer. And initially, people were saying, why are you doing this? It's complicated. And it's like, no, you need one click anyway to move on. You can just as well use it to tell us how sure you are about it. And it's actually incredibly valuable in 3 different ways. So this is a good example of a very simple thing and a very simple way to translate academic research into something that works in the real world. Because 3 things are happening. The first thing, you can go back if you have kids. How many of you have kids you do spelling words with at home? Any? Those of you who have that can go back and do this experiment tonight. Ask them whenever they are ready to spell a word. Then you say, how confident are you about the answer? Show me, just to speed it up, do it with fingers. 3 fingers if you're sure about it, 2 fingers if you're in doubt, and 1 finger if you don't have a clue. What happens is that suddenly you change the entire dynamic of the session with that kid, or with your kid. Because let's say you're doing 30 words. Out of those 30 words, there will be a lot of them where it's like 3 fingers, they're good. Then there will be some where they give you 2 fingers and they're wrong, which is also expected, right? They're in doubt and they get it wrong and you have to go back and repractice it. But what about the next category, the one where they show 2 fingers but they get it right? If you hadn't got the 2 fingers, you would have thought they were as confident about this as all the other ones they get right. But this one is much, much weaker. This one should be revisited. But the last one that I would like you to see if you can observe is the one where they show 2 fingers and then about 5 seconds later you see the 3rd finger. What happened there? They practiced it in their head. And they've done that for all the other ones as well. But for all the other ones, they made the decision early. But what it shows is that they actually get through an extra repetition by just answering this question. So we may actually sneak in an extra repetition for every single question by this simple trick. What is also interesting about this one is it gives you a really strong confidence that they actually know it. The one where you see the 3rd finger delayed. Because what that shows to you is that they've spelled it, they've looked at it on their internal whiteboard, or their brain whiteboard, and they said, yeah, that looks good, I got it. There's a high probability that they can do that again tomorrow. So we use this also to inform the model. So one thing is they get an extra repetition. The second thing is we use it to inform the models about what can we expect with this knowledge over time. But the third thing is something else really important happens. They develop a stronger metacognitive skill of knowing what they don't know. So part of what we were working intensely on back in the early days in medicine was we needed to move people out of the zone where they were unconsciously incompetent. It's a danger zone. That's where stuff happens. Bad stuff happens. Why? Because people are not aware that they're in the danger zone. They think everything is fine. If you're able to move them out of that, and that's why we use simulators in medicine, because you have these arrogant doctors who think they know it all, It's only when you put them into a simulator and show them the consequences of their inadequate patterns of behavior that they begin to realize they may have to change. Often this is not on the medical side. This is when you want to show them team training. Then you show them a video recording, they're like, oh, this is embarrassing how I worked with that nurse. That's one way to move them out of that zone. But another one is to constantly shape the ability to realize, I actually didn't know this. That's not a skill we practice very much. We practice another skill a lot, which is, oh, I know it and I feel good about it. Because in many cases, when people are unconsciously incompetent, they will say they know it, but they don't feel good about it. Something interesting happens here. We were lucky that we were the first ones to do this, so we have the only data where we can look at the first hundreds of millions of responses with this in it. So we looked at the first 384 million, and what happens to the response times over the course of a semester? Very, very small percentage of these students were using it in more than one class, less than 1%. So the data is this size data set, there is no contamination of any real interest. But something really, really interesting happened. This one stayed stable in response time. I know it and I feel good about it, boom. That one stays stable. What doesn't stay stable are the other three. The ones where you're acknowledging that you don't know it, the response times drop like a rock during the first semester. So just the time you save by knowing that you don't know something faster has an impact. But much more importantly, I will claim that the fact that we can show that these response times drop is a strong indirect indication that they've become better at knowing what they don't know in general. The second part that drives the value of an adaptive system is the value of the content. This is a big surprise. We just went through an 8-month scenario planning strategy session at the executive team at McGraw-Hill. Involved a lot of the people, a lot of the team members from the larger corporation. And what's interesting was, in some of the first meetings, I heard comments like, content is dead, or content will be free in the future, that's not part of our future. We need to be a platform player, that kind of stuff. At the end of it, it was pretty clear that content is really, really important also moving forward. Just not content in the form we've seen in the past. Not content where it's sentence after sentence organized in nice spreads with very expensive graphics. But it all comes down to how high granularity can you get. Anybody can see what this is? Any suggestions? Everybody will agree it's a face, right? Is it a man or a woman? Nobody knows. Facebook would not even recognize it as a face. It is actually me. But the whole point is, here, we cannot really say much about it. We can guess. Here, it's very, very precise. Nobody would be in doubt. What does that mean? It means that if we're able to have enough pixels to describe where is the student at in terms of learning, we have a much better chance of figuring out where to go next. So resolution matters. But resolution also matters in other ways, or granularity matters. It also matters because, think about it, what if we have content chunks that are 15 minutes long? How many adaptations can you make per hour? 4, right? 1 every 15 minutes. What if you have 30 seconds chunks? How many can you make per hour? 120, right? If you think about an old school lessons by mail course, you submitted something one week. That's how I got my educational degree. That's also why I do not publish it anywhere, that I have it. 1 adaptation per week. The company out there that after us brags about making the most adaptations make about 50 per 5 hours. So 1 every 6 minutes. We make 605 hours, 120 per hour. Is that overdoing it? Maybe. But what's the worst thing that can happen is that we just very precisely mold it around the individual. We think that it matters just as much as when you move from one resolution on GPSs to another one, suddenly they became useful. There is definitely a critical threshold under which adaptive systems don't work just because of resolution. The third aspect is one of my really strong passions, which is the motivation. And I'll show you in a second that the first 2 drives motivation alone. So they are kind of interrelated. So it's not a perfect scientific formula, this one, because the first 2 drives motivation in itself. But you also have to look at motivation in other ways. This is actually from the same math program. It also applies everywhere else. What is interesting here is that these are a number of students that are special in different ways. This student here, who has spent 140 hours on learning this, I guarantee you she's not particularly stupid. She's my daughter. But she was also a 7th grader when she started using this. And this is product that ends at 12th grade math. She did it in another language. I gave it to her to prepare her to moving to the US so that she wouldn't be hitting a brick wall when she got into an American math class, because there is not a single term in math that is the same in Danish and in English. What's interesting about this is that even though she has periods of time where she's struggling, if you could see the x-axis here, which is time, this is proficiency. She has a 7-8 hour period of struggling here where she's making almost no progress. Think about it, not getting the reward of progress for 7-8 hours. This is not clock time, this is working time. 7-8 hours, there are like multiple several hour plateaus, but she gets out of them. And notice what happens, actually on all of them, she accelerates back. There is a rapid acceleration back to the line in most of these cases. So you lose something, but then you catch up. What do you think happens to the feeling of being able to learn math after that has happened a couple of times? It skyrockets. What do you think has happened to the 3/4 of the world that hates math? My guess is many of them stalled on some of these plateaus and gave up and decided, I'm just not good at math. There is no way out of the maze for them. So how can that have happened? So first of all, I think it's actually a matter of how did we teach math in the past. But I also think that currently, and how we've used computers in math the last years, have a large part of the responsibility. So think about homework systems in math. How many of you have seen homework systems in math? Electronic, are you using any homework systems in math where they have to do their homework on computers?
Yeah, we have one of those.
So there is something interesting with them. How many of you have made math assignments where you had to show your work? Otherwise, the teacher wouldn't grade it. How many had a teacher who would grade math homework, written math homework, if you didn't show your work, didn't show the intermediate steps? Anybody? That you would grade it even if they don't show their work?
Oh, they didn't.
If they didn't show their work, no, you would throw it right back at them saying, I'm sorry, Peter, but I can't help you if you don't show your work. How many homework systems allow you to show your work? Up to 4th grade, yes. Carnegie Learning made one some years ago where you could show your work. Up to 4th grade, but the rest of it, they don't. What do they do instead? They use algorithms, algorithmic problems, algorithmically generated problems. So they give you a problem, and then they give you an input box and say, what's the answer? Then you're supposed to do your work on a sheet of paper that you later trash. What happens next? If you're good, you get a pat on the back and you can move on. If you have failed, what does the homework system do? It says, give me the pen, let me show you how to do it. It gives you a model answer, right? Let me just show you how to do this. You got it? No closed loop on whether they got it or not. Basically what you do is you increase the cognitive load on the student because they've made a mistake somewhere, right? You show them a model answer, and then the student needs to perform a much higher cognitive operation, which is to extrapolate from the model answer what mistake they made in the first place. What are the chances for success there? Particularly if you're a student who are just about to give up on one of the plateaus. And then we say, you know what, let me give you another one. I'll make an algorithmically generated different one, and now you can fail again. Students do that 16, 17 times, sometimes, before they finally pick it up. That's not motivating. When we started working on this some years ago, I tried to convince the math team at McGraw-Hill that they should trust that we could do this. They said, we don't want to hear about that. We want to hear about your algorithmic engine. So you want to hear about the algorithmic mean drilling sergeant engine, the ones where we can really beat them up, the one that is actually from a computer science point of view super trivial to make, but they could not abstract from the fact that that was the expectation for how a homework system should work. Luckily, we're in a different place now because we found a way to crack this nut so the computer doesn't go bananas when you allow them to show the work. The problem is, you saw the map. There is an infinite number, hold your breath, an infinite number of not incorrect things you can do in math. Computers don't like that. Computers end up in an endless loop calculating for 3 million years, trying to figure out whether this is wrong. So the problem is you have to simplify that. We made a computer science breakthrough that simplified it so that we can handle it. What that does is something spectacular. This is what this program does behind this. So when they're struggling, the first thing that happens when you show your work, we ask them, okay, there is a problem here on this intermediate step. Can you see what it is? In many cases, we actually take the students through the scolding engine in the traditional systems for innocent mistakes. How do learners respond to being punished for innocent mistakes? Not well. So what you can do instead is you can say, can you see the mistake? And little Peter says, oh yeah, this one should have been a plus. Let me move on. You're like, perfectly fine, just move on. Fix it, you can move on, you got a success. So instead of doing 3 or 4 where he completely didn't pick up because he was looking at a model solution that did something else, he was trying to compare and he couldn't really figure it out, he just did another one, made another innocent mistake. So the first thing is a really simple thing that you all do if you're human teachers. All of you would do this if you were there face to face. You would just say, there's a problem here. Can you see what it is? Also because you have picked up that it's innocent. Computer's not good at that though. But the next thing is, what if they don't pick it up? Then at least you know what it is. If you then are able to analyze the mistake back to what is the underlying math concept that went wrong. Maybe that's not what you're trying to teach. They can easily have applied a completely unrelated concept incorrectly, trying to solve this problem. But if you're then able to go back and remediate that specifically, then you can much faster come back to talking about what is it we want to talk about today. What's interesting about motivation is also that if you do all of these things, you can actually get some remarkable numbers. If any of you have tried to measure students' compliance with learning interventions, I think you will be surprised about this. We do this as part of calibrating how much pressure we put on students, because obviously we want to push them as hard as they can take, but not over the edge. The majority of them say it's about right, the amount of time we ask them to spend on this. Many of them study 20-30% harder when they use these adaptive products, simply because they know where their weaknesses are, and they feel that if they spend a little bit more time, it's valuable. And if you add the ones that say we can push them even harder, it's 85% of the students who are accepting the educational intervention and what we're asking them to do. What's interesting about this is, try to see what happens when they get under pressure. You can see the fluctuations in this, which are where the finals are. The peaks are where the finals are. The more pressure they get under, the less compliant they are. So you can see that this is actually it's a quite precise measure of where they are at. So we trust that the general tendency in this, that it's 80-85% that are fine with what we're doing, is probably quite right. This one is their feeling of how valuable it has been for them. 65% are saying it's very or extremely helpful. If you add the ones that are saying that it's just moderately valuable, the number is 95%. It's really, really high. It's unheard of. We've measured a lot of our other products as controls for this. We're more at the 50% level. We also have some internal controls for this, which were not deliberate, but we have occasionally, particularly in the early days, made products that didn't work. We made a marketing product or a management product where the content was a disaster. It was immediately reflected on these ratings. It is actually good that when we do something where we do not live up to the 3 factors of what makes it valuable, we can immediately see it on these ratings. Then we fixed the content and the ratings went up. In medicine or in clinical trials, we call that a crossover study. This was an unintentional crossover study, but we saw the effect we were expecting when we fixed it. In terms of outcomes, there's a big macro impact of this. Probably 1/3, we can prevent 1/3 of the dropouts. This is an independent study made on 4 different colleges. It's in anatomy and physiology. You can see that 50% more A's. Where are they taken from? They're taken from here. Classic question to ask right now, which was the first one I asked, was, holy cow, what happened here? How does that correspond with the dropouts? But the dropouts happened prior to the finals. This group up here had all the saved dropouts to dilute. And of course, they're weaker students, so of course that will impact the lower grades. But they had the 35% that did not drop out up here are included here, of course. That's the reason why I don't see a bigger impact at the tail end of it. It's my best hypothesis.